everybody, and welcome back to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today, as always, is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friends, Charles.
Yes, we say friends plural today because we are joined by a very special guest. You may recognize him from his revolutionized children's literature with the infamous cult novel Smack, which was the winner of the Carnegie Mellon, and then the Guardian's Children Fiction Prize, and then Doing It, which was the winner of the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. In his first adult novel, Loki, he breathes new life into Norse myths, and we're super happy to discuss the book today with him. Everyone, please welcome Melvin Burgess. Melvin, thank you so much for coming on to the show.
I'm just delighted to be here. Thank you very much. Always lovely to talk fantasy with friends.
Yes, well said. We couldn't say it better ourselves, actually. And fantasy is kind of, looking at your previous works here. Fantasy is kind of a new foray for you. You've written so many well-received children's books. What made you just decide, after all that success, to dabble into the fantasy genre?
Well, I had done some fantasy before, I don't know whether they made it across to you guys. I did a couple of books called Blood Tide and Blood Song, which were based on the Norse Volsunga saga, which was really the inspiration for Tolkien, which is the inspiration of practically the whole genre, isn't it? The Volsunga saga, you can see the beginnings of Smaug and so much that Tolkien used. So but it was it was a YA book, so it isn't the first time I've dabbled in the realms of fantasy. I've always adored mythology. It's been a big thing with me my whole life. And Norse mythology is the business. I always kind of think that the Greek gods are a bit sort of, they're a bit wet behind the ears, aren't they? Paddling around in the Mediterranean, whereas the Norse bunch, they're much more suited to the northern moors that I live on up here. So that's the business. And yeah, Loki's always been my favorite god. What more need I say?
Well, we can tell because the charm really comes across. And I would also say too that this is your first adult novel. Is that correct? And I'd be hard to imagine this book Loki being a YA novel, because you really go for it in this book multiple times. What was that like for you? Was there some kind of catharsis, really getting like, well, if I'm writing an adult book, I'm just going to lean into it? Or was it just natural for the character?
well, I mean, I've done such a lot of YA books, and I've sort of had a reputation of not really holding back with my YA books. But nevertheless, there are some themes which you feel aren't really necessary for people still in their teen years. And in the myths, Loki has actually done most of them. So I felt actually that I was trying to stick true to the god. All that business with the building the citadel and the horse and all the very dodgy things that Loki gets up to. He was reviled back in the day, but by the other gods for the stuff that he got up to. He was always, not very well behaved. I have to say, I did enjoy it though. I just sort of felt, oh, come on, it's Loki. We've just got to go for it, and we've got to give him his head in every sense of the word, and let him just. So I enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun, and
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, even in your breakout hit junk, if you want to call it children's or YA, you're talking about heroin addicted teenagers and things like that. So it sounds like you're pushing boundaries in children's and young adult. And then when you're given free reign in full out adult work, you go for it. And it also seems like you're saying, I would look up after I'd read a scene in here. I'm like, that was wacky. Did Loki actually do that in the mythology? And I would look, I'd be like, oh, wow. Loki did actually do that in the mythology.
He did all that stuff. That's what's so great about it. He No, you always think of, the Vikings, they're so sort of, butch and manly and muscular and going around smiting people and all the rest of it and rape and pillage. But, Loki was completely no hold bars and in every direction. He was not necessarily very blokey, nothing was out of bounds. If it was out of bounds, you could bet Loki was there doing it. So, he's the one. He's the one. He's funny. He's charming. He's completely transgressive. He's great.
He definitely does stick out, especially he talks so much about Thor and Odin, and he loves to kind of talk down about Thor as being this brutish, typical Viking guy. So you see the voice come through in that quite a bit. And that's one of the things that Dylan and I, when we were reading through this, were super impressed by with this book, is how you managed to create this, like, I'm going to call it modern voice for Loki. And I just wanted to kind of pick your brain a little bit. How do you get started writing a book? Because basically Loki is telling the story to the reader. He's like, sit down, you little humans, and let me tell you the story of the gods, how it really happened. and then he goes and tells this, like, narrating this story. So how do you get into that voice of a figure like Loki, a god?
Well, there have been a lot of retellings of those myths, and all sorts of people have had a go at it, but very rarely in the first person, because it's the gods, and I think people are a little bit wary of that. Loki, I mean, I kind of felt that Loki feels as though his time has come. We've seen a lot of very successful. I mean, he's called the father of lies, isn't he? We've seen a lot of very successful liars on both sides of the Atlantic in recent years, haven't we? So I think Loki kind of felt that, maybe his time has come. Maybe it's time to sort of let rip. And the thing about him is he is the father of lies. He admits that he's the father of lies. And I suppose the real question at the back of the reader's mind, and at the back of my mind, in fact, while I was writing it, was, how much is he telling the truth? How much is he lying through his teeth?
Right.
And being a completely untrustworthy character, he's certainly appealing to our perhaps our more liberal sentiments, and saying, look, I'm the good guy. History is always written by the winners. I was manifestly a loser. I got chained down in the bowels of the earth with a venomous serpent dripping poison onto my face. I'm a loser. So, this is the real version. Believe me. So in a sense, he's putting on a voice. He's trying to appeal to us, and he's trying to find a way of reaching out to us. So that was kind of my way in. I felt, that he was adopting a modern voice. He was trying to find a way to communicate with us, because he feels as though maybe we could be on his side if he can convince us that despite his lousy reputation and his manifest dishonesty, that he's someone that we can relate to and we can help. So that's how it came about. I mean, the other thing about it is that I've always felt with a lot of retellings of the Norse myths that they're always told in this kind of folktale kind of way, Yeah. It's always like, once upon a time this happened and that happened and the other happened. And but it's myth, and it was religion, so it's got to have something numinous about it, and it's got to have something, really, really fierce and powerful, and with mystery and tragedy and something numinous in it. So and I hope that there are occasions where he's talking, for example, about Odin being hanging from the tree for 9 days, or maybe even the birth of his 3 monstrous children, where he kind of he actually addresses that true mythic quality, So I didn't want him to be ordinary in any way. I didn't want him to be like some guy, a second-hand car salesman that you meet by the pub who's giving you any gab. He has to have the weight of the deity behind him, but at the same time, he is a complete untrustworthy liar. of the best
Yeah.
kind.
I
And
love
that's oh,
how
go ahead, Dylan.
he's always uh, trying to say, "Oh, I'm like I'm not giving enough credit," and you can try to see the ways in which he's twisting things in his own direction. And that's a
Yeah,
great job, like the subtlety you use in that, where you're so entrenched in Loki's voice that you trust the reader, though, to read between the lines and say, like this one. He'll
let's see.
even say like, "Oh yeah, was I occasionally having another relationship with other people in the middle of my marriage?" Yeah, sure. But like everyone was doing that. It was like the golden age, those kind of things. And he glosses over those, but emphasizes his role in everything good that has happened. So it feels very true to what the father of lies would be telling us, especially when he's got a motive. He's trying to win us mortals over to his side.
For
Yeah,
sure.
yeah. He's definitely got an agenda. He's definitely got an agenda. I did like, as I say, once the voice came, I started off. I just sat down and I wrote that introduction. And once I'd got that voice, and it didn't take very long, then really you could just sort of sit back and let him go, and it almost sort of wrote itself. I'm very familiar with those myths.
Mhm.
So yeah, and he was, like the chapter, all the good things I've done. I mean, he's, I don't know how tough he is sometimes. You sort of think, really, you did that? It was a golden age because of you, was it? Really?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, sure, it
And
was. Come on.
sometimes,
You can't believe these guys. Look how violent and atrocious they were. They're absolute thugs,
Sure.
and
yeah.
they are. So you think, oh, maybe it is true.
But the use of first person, like you mentioned earlier, is another interesting piece to this because it allows the mischief to take like an even deeper root into the narrative, right? Because he's like, yeah, you guys can owe your existence to me. See the sun. I played a critical part in that. There would be no sun without Loki. And you're like, I don't remember learning about
Well,
that, but
it's sometimes it's as simple as like I kind of mentioned to Odin at one
Yeah,
point, like, oh, wouldn't it be great to like have some sort of like bright object or whatever? Like, I don't know the exact wording, but his critical role is like I mentioned it at some point, and then Odin did all the work. But like, if it weren't for me, then you'd
it
never
would
see
never
the
have occurred
sun.
to me. I know. He somehow or other seems to be behind practically everything good that ever happened
Yeah.
Pretty much.
to the human race. The sun, indeed the creation of life himself, or life itself, certainly human
True.
life, which, although not perhaps in the way that we'd care for ourselves, I think that on that particular, I don't think Loki could help himself
No.
dissing the human race.
And then every time after he tells that creation story, he has a new clever name for us that I'll
Right.
let readers I'll let
Right.
readers pick up the book and
Yeah,
find out.
readers
But I was laughing
pick up
every
on
time.
that
And
one.
literally
Yeah.
it's like, it happens right in the beginning, and then every other time he addresses
Yeah.
humans for like 150 pages, 200 pages. It's like, oh, this guy's committed to the bit.
Oh yeah. He's not letting you forget that he's the big guy and that you're really, really not. He's really, yeah. It was so much fun. It was so much fun. He's, I don't know. Everyone. I kind of think with Loki, that everyone knows someone a bit like that. Very charismatic, charming, funny. Okay, completely lying, but to start off, you always feel, well, he's lying for us. He's our liar. He's great. And then, of course, at the end of it, you realise that actually, do you know what? He's been lying to you all along, just like all the other dopes. So,
For sure. You had mentioned before that you were very familiar with the Norse mythology. What I'm be curious to know, like, how far back does your like appreciation of the Norse mythology go? How did you get into it? How did you kind of come about becoming so knowledgeable about it that the voice of Loki just channeled through you?
channeling the voice of the deity. Yes, that's what I'd like to think.
Yeah,
Well,
right.
it goes back a long way. I mean, when I was still at primary school. Now, my dad used to work for various publishing firms. He used to write a lot of educational material, and he worked for now who is it now? Was it Faber? I think it was. No. I can't remember the Oxford University Press. It was OUP, and they did publish a whole series of myths and folk tales. And he used to bring them home for me. Czechoslovakian folk tales, tales of the moors, tales of the forests, folk tales of Britain, folk tales of, Sweden, all this sort of thing. And he did bring a book back called Tales of the Norse Gods and Heroes by a woman called Barbara Leone Pickard, who used to do a lot of that back in the day, So I must have been about 9 or something, I suppose, something like that when he bought this, and they immediately caught my imagination. I always loved the gods. I just thought it was fantastic. I liked, I think, the fact that with Loki as well, there is the beginnings of a story. The other gods they do things, and it's like short stories. They do this and they do that. But there, towards the end of the Loki cycle, there is this business of him killing Balder and then trying to escape, and then going to the feast and insulting the other gods, and then being hunted down and all the rest of it. So there is this kind of downfall thing going on with Loki, which somehow sort of echoes the whole Ragnarok principle. So yes, it goes back a long way, and I just always really liked it. And when I started my career doing YA, shortly after doing Junk and doing it, actually, I wanted to have a go at the Volsunga saga. There's a whole host of these sagas, Icelandic sagas, dozens of them, a lot of them actually really recounting actual historical events of actual historical people. And most of them I didn't adore quite as much, but the Volsunga saga had this magical element to it, and it's a family beloved of Odin, and really a really magical and extraordinary story. I mean, in many ways, it's like the sort of North European hero myth. So I wanted to have a go at that. So I did that. I wrote that partly in the first person and partly in the third person. That did pretty well. But so I have had plenty of opportunity to acquaint myself with these myths. I did quite a bit of research for the Blood Tide and Blood Song. I already knew the basic myths, but of course you can start then getting into the original manuscripts, Snorri and the Edda, the Elder and the Younger Edda, and various other sources and so forth, if you want. Although in some ways, if you're taking a riff on these myths rather than simply retelling them, then you're allowed, I feel, to make stuff up, basically. Doing Loki. I mean, one of the wonderful things about doing Loki, of course, is that as the loser, his version of those old stories isn't going to be the one that came down to us via Snorri and through the Elder and Younger Edda, because it's going to be completely different. So you can make it up. You can decide that actually it's his fault, that it's his responsibility that the sun is here, and you can change things because we all know that the winners write history. So you can muck around with those myths because Loki's telling his own version. So that sort of, so my relationship with it does go back a long way. And I had already written these 2 books in which I was kind of taking a bit of a chance and retelling those stories in a different way to the way that they were written down. So it goes back a long way. It goes back a long way, and I still adore them. I still read them, and the characters and the quality of them come up. There's still, it's a shame, really. There seems to be such a lot has been lost, I'm sure. Unfortunately, the northern European civilization wasn't as literate as the Greeks, for example. So there's them. loads missed. There's very little about the goddesses, for example. There's whole reams of stuff, and there's hints here and there. I mean, there's a hint, for example, that Loki had another family, and that he lived amongst the giants, amongst the Jotun, as a woman, and gave birth to other children whom we hear nothing about in what we've got. So actually there's loads more you could do if you wanted. It's just a question of how much you're prepared to make it up and how much you want to base it on what's there.
Yeah, well, I like how you're getting at this idea that using Loki as the narrator, both by nature of him being the loser of history, if you will, and by nature of him being a master of deceits. Anytime you choose to take that creative license and make your subtle changes or drastic changes in some cases, all you're doing is further building the character of your narrator and leaning into that. So it's a very clever and creative mechanism for being able to tell the version that you want to tell of these.
Yeah, I've been thinking about it for a long time. I've got a friend of mine, a poet friend of mine, and I was saying, we were planning on doing something together. And I was thinking, well, I could sort of tell the stories, and you, as the poet, could do, the voice of the gods. And then I was sort of thinking, why should I give this guy the best bit? The voice of the gods. That's the interesting. Right. That's the really interesting thing, So I've been trying to think for a long time how I might approach retelling those myths in a fresh way, and not going into that sort of folk tale-y kind of, once upon a time, in this sort of stuff, how I could do that. And it was during lockdown. It was during lockdown, over here, while we were all sort of stuck at home during COVID, and we had a lot of building work going on here. And my wife and I had taken a place right up on the tops. I mean, we live on the Pennines, and we had a house right up on the tops, right on the edge of nowhere. You could look out the window and you could just see this flat moorland stretching on forever, and the big valley in front of us. And during the winter, you'd wake up and the snow would be about 8 feet high. It was a good place to write, Norse mythology. And so I sat down one day and I thought, okay, maybe this is how to do it. Maybe Loki can give us a version. He's got every reason to have a different version and to tell us a different version. He's always been my favorite god. So yeah, I just sat down and as I say, that voice, once I'd got the voice, it was no problem at all. It just sailed along. It was one of the best writing experiences I've had for a very long time. I did sometimes really feel as though, I was channeling the deity. He was, it wasn't anything to do with me. I mean, you're one of my favorite American writers, Kurt Vonnegut. Once famously said to a room full of writers, let's lock the doors, let's close all the windows, and admit just amongst ourselves that none of this is anything to do with us. This all comes down from above, and we're just channeling whatever it is, all the writing and the thing like that. And it does feel like that sometimes, because it's all coming from, it's in your unconscious where this stuff happens. It isn't as though you're sort of sitting down using your logical bits, but this one, it was more like that than anything. The voice just, off he went.
Yeah, and it's funny to hear that you almost gave away some of this prose and voice stuff to a poet, and then meanwhile this novel's been heaped with praise, especially for the prose and the voice. I know SFX called it a beautifully lyrical masterwork. I mean, must feel
very
nice that you. Right.
Very nice. Loki will be delighted.
He'll take all the credit, I'm sure.
He'll take all the credit. He'll be up on his dungeon wall.
The Melvin guy what to say. So,
well, you're only helping him by saying that you were channeling him. He's going to enjoy taking that credit.
Nothing to do with me. None of that transgression. It's any of my responsibility at all.
That must be why he chose you. He knew you'd take no credit and let him have all
no credit for this. Yeah, none of it. Not the charm, not the humor, not the clever sprech, not the transgressiveness, not that business with the horse. None of it. Nothing to do with.
You don't like it, take it up with him. And all the Norse mythology.
Yeah, see how far that gets you.
And like what also fascinates me about like this idea of the Loki character, yes, he presents this great opportunity to retell and maybe put some extra poetic license into these classic Norse mythology retellings. But what he also does is he's able to bring, like you said earlier, this like contemporary like you're able to make a very contemporary thematic connection to history today through Loki, because Loki in a lot of ways is trying to be like, guys, together, like there's this problem with people in power today, and all I'm trying to do is just be accepting and cool and like do fun stuff all the time. It's like, maybe there's a problem with that, and the way like you use the Loki character to kind of have this like theme of today, especially towards the end when you bring it all back. I don't want to spoil anything, of course,
and
but
in the acknowledgments.
and the acknowledgments
I
as
saw
well.
that.
Well,
So it's like,
when I was sitting down with it, it was literally because, politics, in this country, in your own country at the time, it was just these barefaced liars, just, as far as I'm concerned, just lying and lying and lying, and everyone's going, "Oh, great, really?" I mean, our delightful Mr. Johnson, it was just, so I just thought, well, obviously, it's the age of the liar, so let's go for it.
but then you made Loki the liar, the honest one.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? I mean, can you tell? Maybe
Right.
he's telling the truth after all. I mean, I was convinced. I was convinced.
In jazz, they say it's the notes you don't play. I think it's the lies you don't tell, right? It's how you weave truth into it that makes it more believable. I feel like that's Loki's method, is sneak in those lies at the right point. It's a more clever way of doing the lies and getting them to be believable.
A good liar always starts off with the truth.
Yeah.
And I think that, actually, a really talented liar, someone who really knows how to use lies, they can actually sometimes use the truth itself in a dishonest fashion. And I think Loki occasionally rises to that peak,
It certainly. And I was reading it and I was like, this is, as old as a lot of these stories are, there's a lot of these issues that have come up, especially even since COVID to now. There's been a lot of conversations in politics around like you tackle things like sexuality and gender, and a few of those things make a huge are huge themes in your book. And I'm like, wow, these are, Dylan and I were like, did these things really happen to Loki? It's like, yes, they were written a long time ago. And then it's like, wow, that the fact that I think why a lot of people will say it's both contemporary in tone and a contemporary work is because it is amazing how like we're still having these conversations today. They're still at the top of contention in politics, and Loki's like, what's the issue? Like, this is who I am and I live this life all the time. It's no problem.
Yes, it's I mean it is one of the things about myth, I think, as opposed to what you might call folk tale, is that it does kind of reach into life in a way which carries on through time, and that these kind of these stories have something to say. That's why they last. It's because people read them and they think, oh yeah, I can relate to that. I can relate to that in my life. And Loki, as I say, his place in the Norse pantheon carries an awful lot of those things. If you go to sort of Hinduism and so forth, the business of having gods that can change gender or have both genders, or gay gods, and heterosexual gods, and whatever. They're all over the place. In the Norse world, in that apparently very male world that we know. I mean, it seems as though actually archaeologically, it seems as though it's a bit less male than we've been thinking for a long time. They've started realizing that some of those warrior burials were actually women. So maybe maybe our version of it wasn't quite as butch as it looked in the old films. But Loki carries an awful lot of those quandaries and those questions in him. His sexuality isn't straightforward. His identity is, he's a shape changer. Sometimes he's male, sometimes he's female. Sometimes he's straight, sometimes he's gay. He operates in terms of identity on so many different levels, in relatively few stories. I mean, and I think that's another thing that makes him so interesting. If you think of Thor, he sort of hits big guys with a hammer, and kind of that's as far as it goes, and I suppose they say he was the protector of the poor, and he looked after the peasants, because he was keeping the big forces away, the Jotun, the giants, and so forth. So I should think if you had a hard basic life, you might look at Thor for your protection. But Loki's a lot more complex than that. He's a lot more interesting than that. His character is it's sort of slippery, but it's multifaceted. So yeah, he still carries an awful lot of those issues, as you say, about identity, and identity is such a big issue. Certainly, well, I mean, on both sides of the Atlantic, isn't it? People are always discussing these things. So yeah, he's there. He's right there. I had a lot of help off trans folk and non-binary folk. We had a reader, very good American trans woman who helped us, with this, and was very interested in mythology herself. So it was very helpful, and so that was looked at. And I had very few issues, a few things, I mean, obviously from that particular perspective, you always get something wrong,
Sure.
When you're looking at other identities, whether it's a sexual thing or a racial thing, you're always going to get something wrong. So there were a few things wrong, which I was very happy to sort of pull out. Trying to remember what they are now, but I don't think it was anything really very significant. But yes, that modern approach, and the fact that those old stories actually still tell those kind of tales is very interesting. I think that those old stories came down to us really via Snorri, the Icelandic or Norwegian guy who wrote them down, just so that basically because the poetic tradition there and the kennings, the images that they used, everyone, like, the Wales Road, for example, famously, which is the sea, those sorts of things. A lot of them referred to the gods, and a lot of them referred back to these old stories. So he was really just writing them down so that people would recognize what the poems were talking about when they came out with these images, these similes. So we don't know what he did and what he didn't do and what his attitude was. It was certainly already in a Christian era. So, how much he Christianized it, and, what he left out, and exactly how people would have viewed those deities back in the day is something that is gone. We can't capture that. But maybe it was not quite as butch as it comes down to us. Maybe it was very different. And I like to think that maybe Loki was a little more highly regarded than he came down to us. There is a story which is nearly always left out of the Norse retellings because it's regarded as a folk story, which comes from the Faroe Islands, and not written down in this list of sort of the proper myths that you get in from Norway and Iceland. Okay, and it's a great story in which Loki is actually the hero. It's basically it's have I got time to quickly tell this story?
Sure.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's,
yeah, yeah.
I'll just very quickly go through it. You know, it kind of shows another side of Loki, I think, which you don't necessarily get. Basically, there's a fisherman, okay, and he loves playing chess. He's a fantastic chess player. And one day a giant comes along and says, you know, I'll play you at chess, you know, but let's make a bet on it. And the bet is, you know, the giant will give him loads of gold if he wins, but if he loses, he has to give him his son. And of course, he loses. So then he prays to Odin, and Odin, I think he turns the boy into a single grain of wheat, which he puts on a single ear of corn in the wheat field, you know, and the giant goes out, mows it all down, gets it. Then he prays to Freya, who turns the boy into a piece of down on a swan's breast, which has migrated over to the Arctic Circle or something. The giant goes out and gets that. So then they pray to Loki, and Loki turns him into a single cod egg in a sort of massive roe in a huge cod. Giant goes out and, you know, gets it. And Loki goes with him fishing, you know, and he sees the egg and he says, you know, what's that? And the guy says, just a little fish egg, you know. So he blows it. Loki blows it out of his hand, turns him back into the boy, and he says, go and hide in your father's boathouse. So the boy runs into the boathouse, and the giant goes chasing after him, sticks his head in the boathouse, and then Loki slams the door down and chops his head off. The great thing about it is that Loki's the hero, but he does it by cheating. None of the other gods, Odin, he says, oh, he found it, I'm sorry, you know, you'll have to, you know, I've done what I can. And Frey is the same thing, but Loki's like, no way is he going to beat me. You know, he cheats. And in any other folk story, you know, it would have been, oh, you know, you'd have had to have been clever and you'd have had to work it out. But Loki, you know, never mind the rules. Chops the giant's head off. So, and that's the side of Loki that you kind of hope he is going to be on your side, because, you know, he will get you what you want. He just won't do it very honestly. That's all.
Yeah. Well, something I wanted to bring up, Melvin, is so with the Marvel movies and all that, Loki and Thor had a little bit of a moment out there. It's obviously a much more PG version of what went on with those characters, but it's interesting. Did you keep that stuff in mind, that like people have these images of Thor and Loki that are probably at this time much more informed by Marvel movies than they are by the like ancient myths?
Well, you know, I mean, I like the Marvel movies. You know, I watch the Marvel movies. I quite enjoy them. I'm not quite so keen on Thor as a hero. I was always a bit. He wasn't my favorite one, and I'm not hugely keen on the Marvel Loki. You know, possibly because I know the original version. I don't really feel as though those myths enjoyable, those films, you know, and the comics as well, enjoyable though they are. I don't really feel that they're about Norse mythology. You know, they've taken those characters and they've turned them into sort of you know, American superheroes in the tradition of American superheroes. You know, Thor's the goodie, Loki's the baddie most of the time. They've borrowed a bit of the complexity of his character, you know, because, you know, sometimes he can be kind of handy, you know, but I don't really feel that they've tried to plunder the actual myths or the actual mythology, except they've just kind of taken the names and the roles in a very general way, which, you know, it's fine. You know, it's these things. The great thing about these old stories is that they're not under copyright. You know, you can do what you want. Anyone can sit down and write about Odin or Thor or Loki, and no one's going to come and say, "Hoi, you know, you can't do that. It's mine," because, you know, it belongs to all of us already. So no, I didn't really bear them in mind. I was sort of thinking, oh, you know, maybe people will be interested in reading this version because he's so well known. I'm no longer so sure about that now, because I hadn't quite realized how many books had already been written about Loki. You know, if you go, there's dozens of them out there, aren't there? You know, there's everyone's had a go. So you know, there are many different Lokis. You can take your pick.
Sure. And I also think that if you're coming into this just with your understanding of like Thor and Loki, the superheroes, I was super interested in the interpretation of Thor as kind of like the villain in this story constantly, and also like the punching bag for this typical machismo kind of presentation of Norse mythology as well. So as I would really love to talk for a second about how you channeled Thor in this story. Although we don't get his voice, we certainly get a perspective of Thor because, I think what people know going into this, if they just know just what's in popular culture, is that they're at odds, but they're kind of family and they kind of, although they're totally different, but Thor is always presented as this like superhero, man of the people kind of guy. So, what was it like? Just through channeling Loki, you're like, okay, now I've got to take this position on Thor. Now, how did you kind of develop this interpretation of Thor?
Thor, Thor's never really been my favorite
Right.
Norse god, I have to say.
It comes off.
He's kind of straight. You can probably tell. He's a kind of straightforward. He's a kind of straightforward, guy, isn't he? Really, and that there's not much complication. You'd want him on your side in a fight. I'll go that far.
Yeah.
So I just think he's. I mean, as soon as Loki arrived in Asgard there, then he immediately started dissing the whole thing, didn't he? They were all living in caves, clutching turnips to their chests, and if it wasn't for him, they wouldn't even have basic sanitation, would they? So Thor was always going to be a prime target. If you read the myths, Thor is a threat to Loki pretty well throughout, and in that final sequence where he's engineered the death of Hod, when he goes back to the feast, he goes back after he's done that and he's run off. He goes back at one point to try and wheedle his way back into into Asgard. He goes to a feast at the halls of Aegir, the sea god, and it's when Thor turns up. He sort of says, any more of your, because Loki's basically insulting everyone. I don't know how he thinks that's going to come across. I think he's just lost it by then. But I mean, Thor makes it very clear he will kill him. And in the end, when he's turned himself into a salmon to try and avoid the net of the other gods, it's Thor who catches him by the tail. And this is why the salmon always has a thin tail, because he was gripped by Thor. So in the tales, there is that element of animosity. There's also an occasion when they go adventuring together. That sort of happens. But I just think that Thor's just an obvious target for Loki. The big soldier guy, the guy who goes around killing everyone, the guys who goes smashing the giant skulls. He's not someone that you're gonna that you're gonna big up. You're not gonna do it. And the other thing about Loki is, I think that perhaps this is his weakness. He just can't help himself. He can't really stop himself from insulting people. I mean, for example, with the creation of humanity myth, I mean, he didn't have to go that far. He just can't stop. And with Thor, he was just absolutely going to have to insult him. That moment in Aegir's Hall, in the actual mythology, when he's going along and he's wanting to drink with the other gods, it's called the flighting of Loki, and he just insults everyone there. He just insults absolutely everyone. So he's, that side of his nature has overtaken him, and he has become out of control, really, in a sense. So I think that's where it came from. I do think that the aspects of Loki, nearly all of them are there. I think they're there in the myths. I don't think I necessarily, I mean, giving it that modern twist and then turning them into Loki's version of history, if you like. You know, was a position that I took. But I think that most of it does actually most of it does have its roots in those myths, I think. So it's all there. I think it's all there if you look
Absolutely.
for it.
Yeah, it's super interesting to see the complications of these relationships combined with the interpretation. Another relationship in this book that I found very interesting, I was kind of laughing at throughout, was Loki and Odin. Because Loki's always like, we were brothers, man. We were we were best friends. You know, you guys just weren't, they don't talk a lot about it, but we hung out all the time. And then meanwhile, it's like Odin's doing his own thing. And then you realize that Loki, you know, had like tricked him into giving the oath of brotherhood and this and that. But it was really interesting to see just how at one point Loki's really just looking for like the validation of being kind of the true right hand guy for Odin, like the one who really helped him out the most back when he was, you know, cool and had both eyes and everything, and kind of fell off afterwards, you know. So I would love to get your perspective too of how you approach this Loki Odin relationship. Loki.
That's like a celebrity couple name.
Celebrity couple, yes. Loaded. Well, I mean, Thor was never the most interesting god for my opinion, but Odin, he's interesting. I mean, when you look at his qualities as a god, he really is. He's got a lot going for him. You know, he's the you know, this love of mysteries, this self-sacrifice on the trees. You know, he's sacrificing himself to himself. He's, you know, the side of Norse mythology which is religious, you know, is there in Odin, and the fact that sacrifice to Odin was a human sacrifice, and it was a king. You know, you could only give the best to the best. You know, there was no other way of doing it. So you know, he's really clearly the most important figure in Norse mythology, the most center of the religion, if you like. And so it's very clear that Loki is going to try and ally himself. That stands to reason. But the business of them being buddies, and the business of them having a sort of oath of brotherhood, that is there in the mythology. You know, again, if you look at that feast at the end in Aegir's hall, when Loki goes to drink with them, he says, you know, but we swore an oath of brotherhood once. There was once when you swore that if you were having a drink, I would be there, and that you would, you know, always drink with me. And it's Odin who says, let him in. The other gods wanted to get rid of him, so he has sworn. Odin did at some point swear an oath with Loki, you know, so that has happened, or there is a reference to that happening. We don't have any stories which are actually saying, you know, this is how it happened and this is when it happened, but we are told that it did happen. That's why Loki was actually allowed into that hall, having actually been the main cause of slaying Odin's beloved son, Balder. So yeah, you know, that again, you know, it's where it comes from. It's all there, you know, it's all there in the mythology. And I didn't really have to, you know, I mean, you know, what the start point's there, then off you go, you know, and you invent it and you talk about it and you play with it. The business about Loki tricking Odin into that oath of brotherhood was an invention on my part. But as I say, that story isn't there. We don't hear how that happened. So I was at liberty to make my own version of that. And you know, I think as the father of lies, one of Loki's tricks, if you like, is sometimes to do himself down. You know, he doesn't try and make himself out to be perfect. And then that is one occasion in which he's saying, look, I wanted that oath and I felt as though I deserved that oath. So I made sure I got it and I tricked, well, that's the kind of guy I am, don't you love me for it? So that was where that one came from. The other occasion when he helps Odin, again, a bit of an invention on my part, is the sacrifice of Odin to Odin on that tree, which is one of the more strange bits of Norse mythology, and it is, as I say, a very mystery-based kind of concept that, Odin sacrifices the best sacrificed to the best. That means Odin has to sacrifice himself to himself, which he does. And this is how he brings back the runes, and that there is a bit of poetry which has survived, in which Odin talks about doing this. And in my version, Loki, Odin has to die, and he wants Loki to kill him, and Loki does it reluctantly. Again, I don't know whether you believe him. I have to say that sounded quite truthful to me, because I don't know why else he'd tell that. Maybe he'd tell it because maybe he could have invented it, because if you say something for which there is no other reason than it's true, then that's pretty convincing. Maybe he's just convincing us that he is convincing, because there's layers, aren't there? But yes, that I enjoyed writing that bit. I felt as though that was really Loki talking about. I felt as though he was talking of an experience that had affected him very deeply at the time. And as I say, you can't rule out that he wasn't just making it up in order to show how important he was, and to show that, I'm like you guys. I have deep, meaningful experiences, But but it's all in the mythology. It's just a question of carrying on and talking about it.
It's funny you mentioned that Loki did it reluctantly. It seems like every single bad thing that Loki ever did, he did very reluctantly and under coercive pressure, based on his retelling of this. And I think it's so funny whenever you get to watch Loki try to explain himself in something that I'm sure in the mythology was just painting Loki as the villain of this story. And then Loki's perspective is always, if you were in this position, you would have done the same thing. Like, how else could I have done anything else? And I really appreciate that that element of it.
Yeah, it was, as I say, it was fun. It was such fun to write, and he's the eternal, the most slipperiest customer on earth, I think. Try and pin him down, and it's never his fault. He was always doing his best, and he's just been painted in such dark colors because they need a scapegoat. That's all it is.
Right.
He's the good guy.
Right. And reading the book, I gotta say, has me convinced. I was charmed by the Loki character. I always thought I was, Thor's the hero, right? Thor's cool, but I'm like, yeah, you know what? Kind of overrated.
Just a brutish baby based on Loki's
and Loki pretty much
perspective.
gave him the hammer, right? So I mean, you're good there.
Well, yeah, he did everything, all the good things I've done. He gave him the hammer.
Sure.
He gave him, but I mean, he was in really bad trouble when he gave him the hammer. Otherwise, he would have never done it.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, I think he regretted that one.
I think he regretted that one. Yeah. Thor was bad enough as it was, but Thor's just a thug, really, isn't he? He's just a militaristic skull cracker. Yeah.
That's the way he's presented, for sure. I'm sure
And not even the
team at
brains
Marvel would have a
behind-
different interpretation, but
Also kind of a lackey anyway, too. Not even the brains behind any of the bad things that happen.
Not the brains, just a psychopath, really. I mean, it is a complete hatchet job that Loki is presented as. Thor seems to have no redeeming qualities whatsoever. When they first meet him, he's a bully. when he goes on his first adventures, he's a bully, and yeah, he's not even the brains behind it. It's all Tyr, the god of war, who's using him for his purposes, and Thor's quite happy to be doing anything so long as he's got skulls to crack.
Yeah.
There you go.
There's so much more to get into in this book as well, but I think we got to leave something for the readers here. I think there's a lot to look forward to, just in the way that the story's told, the first person narrative. You've split it into, is it 6 books within the book as well? It's really just a great kind of, I would call it almost a character study of the Loki character. And, as someone who did not have a lot of background and understanding about Norse mythology, and to Dylan's point as well, it's like you almost want to look up this stuff as like, is this one of Melvin's crazy inventions or Loki's crazy inventions? It's impossible to tell. And more often than not, it's Loki's. And that was a real joy to read as well.
Oh, I'm really pleased that you liked it so much. I mean, anyone who enjoys it, I'd encourage you to go and read the Norse myths. They're fantastic. They're fantastic myths, and although so much of classical literature refers to the Greek myths, actually, sort of what you might call ordinary culture, you find it there in the Norse myths. It's not sort of high flown and Latin and Greek and all that kind of stuff. It is our roots as from the North European culture and the Anglo-Saxon culture and the Germanic culture, which is so much of America comes from. Not all, obviously, but quite a bit of it. It's got those roots in it, and I think people relate to it like that. And as for Loki, well, I mean, I hope one of the things was that one of the challenges with the book was to make sure that you could read it and you could enjoy it without knowing the myths, because otherwise you'd actually have to just sell it to students of Norse mythology, so I wanted to kind of get those stories across without actually having to retell them, and I hope that was successful. But anyway, best fun I've had in a long time.
Well, it had a kind of edutainment aspect to it for me, where I felt like I was learning about a lot of Norse mythology. I had to kind of fact check Loki, of course, but
did you
at least set me in the right direction.
Yeah. Well, yeah. It's a very rich mythology. It's a very rich, rich area. And as I say, the character of Loki, so many facets, so many aspects, so many modern references in there, and funny.
Yeah,
there's various bits in there that I didn't put in. I mean, and sometimes I sort of look back and think, oh, why didn't I put that? For example, there's a piece where someone has bet his head, okay, and he's lost, so he owes this person his head, and he says to them, well, you can have my head, but you can have no portion of my neck at all. And they're saying, like, right, how can I cut your head off then? You can't. So there's a bet which he has to make them laugh, and if he can make them laugh, all things are called off. And so the way he makes them laugh in the end, and it's a cold-hearted, frost giantess whose husband he's been responsible for killing. So the way he does it is he ties his testicles to a billy goat. And then the billy goat tries to run away, and Loki gets dragged behind it, howling in pain. And of course, it's absolutely hilarious. This is Viking humor, guys.
Some good slapstick.
So it's a proper bit of slapstick, and it's Loki. So it's typical Loki. It's rude, and he's kind of doing himself down at the same time. He's a great character. As I say, once. If you know the mythology, you'll find so much of it, the roots of my book, there in the mythology. It isn't really like I had to sort of make it up. It all came from there. Once you decided that you're going to put it in a in a modern context and a retelling, then off it goes.
Right. And who knows? Loki seems to be teasing a potential sequel towards, like, throughout the whole book. He's like, well, that could be a story we could tell another day. It's up to you guys if you want to hear it, you know?
There are plenty of other stories. There are
Right.
plenty of other stories. We'll see. We'll see.
We'll see.
I mean,
Yeah,
as I say, I love the Norse mythology, and I might have a look at doing some of the other gods. There's plenty of
Ooh.
interesting things there. We'll
It'd be
see.
fun to get someone else's perspective, and then we could see how they see Loki. I always enjoy that when, and I know you've used multiple point of views in work in the past, so that could be fun. Do you know which ones you're considering, or are you keeping that close to the
Well,
vest?
I mean, there's a number of contenders. One contender is there is a character who's sort of not really a god, but perhaps could be made a god, who's the sort of the Volander, the Smith god. I don't think that would involve a lot of Loki, but I mean, the interesting thing about that is there is in the mythology there is something of a story there, and that would be a very, very, very different voice. So there's that one, and of course, the really interesting ones would be Tyr.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah. I mean, Thor might be interesting because who knows, he might not be the actual sort of clawed-tongued thug that Loki makes him out to be. Who knows? And I don't know, the goddesses are interesting as well. I mean, unfortunately, there's not many stories for those goddesses, but Freya is interesting. There are a few stories about Freya, not always all that complimentary about Freya. She was quite a complicated character as well in some ways, and there are various hints about other things that you might want to write about. So I'm considering my options, although I'm not totally convinced that they'd be as much fun to write as the Father of Lies himself.
Loki was the star of the show for sure, but no, I mean, I would highly recommend this book to anyone who's, the thing that I would praise about this the most is really your voice and your writing style. Those are the things that I was absolutely blown away by. And then obviously the vehicle of Loki has so much potential from there. So I think that anyone who's been interested in these conversations, it's a really contemporary, easy to dive into piece. And it was just a fun reading experience. There's a lot here, and there's some scenes that just only the ancient Nordic people could have invented, that I was like, wow, it's like, I thought our stories today were pushing the envelope, but they've been pushing the envelope for thousands of years here, way beyond.
Really? Yeah. Way out there. Some of that stuff's so way out there, you wouldn't believe it.
Out there. I'm like, wow, and then, but somehow I'm reading this way out there thing, and I'm like, okay, what's next? It's just like you kept me in, you kept me going, and it was some wild stuff. So there's a lot to look forward to in the novel for sure.
Thanks so much. I'm very happy you got it, and I'm very happy that you got it as well. Some people don't get it. They're saying, oh, the language. Oh, some of the things that happen, and they're saying, oh,
Oh yeah, it's easy for people like that to get turned off from this book in about 25 pages maybe, but
you don't have to go very far.
You don't have to go far, but you're picking up a book called Loki. You're gonna get into some wild mischief, and that's all the more fun.
Yeah. He was never known for pulling his punches. He was never known for hiding his light behind a bushel. Yeah. There you go.
He doesn't have
Neither
this
you,
air of
Melvin.
modesty either. Yeah.
When I read your Wikipedia page, my favorite line on it was Burgess again attracted controversy in 2003 with the publication of Doing It. And it's like the again is doing a lot of work there.
Well, life is short. You've got to have a bit of fun, haven't you? And I mean, actually sort of, looking for trying to be controversial for its own sake is a bit of a waste of time. But if something is genuinely controversial, then that's for a reason, and that's attractive. It's attractive to write about if it's actual, an actual sort of something that people have difficult feelings about. One thing I should say, one thing that helped me a lot. I've got a friend of mine who does a lot of theatre. He writes operas, and one of the things that he goes into schools with his little theatre company and presents educational stuff, and then does a little play which is genuinely interactive in the sense that the kids can decide what the ending is and so forth. So occasionally we have a little thing where he plays Heimdall, the guy who guards the Rainbow Bridge in and out of Asgard. Heimdall has had his sword taken away from him by Loki, and then I come on as Loki, and I have to, and Heimdall says the kids give it. The frost giants are there at the bridge, and Asgard is going to be overrun, and Heimdall has to get his confidence back. He's lost all his confidence, and he's if only he gets his confidence back, maybe he could do it. And I have to come in as Loki and say, no, Heimdall, he hasn't got a sword. He's I'll lead you against the frost giants. I'll do it, and I have to convince them. And we have a little competition. And sometimes my friend Martin wins, okay, in which case Heimdall doesn't need his sword. He can just face down the frost giants with his godly powers, and they they clear off. Sometimes they're convinced that I'm actually the guy. And then, of course, I go and I lead the frost guards, the frost giants.
How does that go?
All the kids get slaughtered by the frost giants. I say, "Oh, sorry, you should have known better, really, shouldn't you?"
Don't trust Loki.
So yeah, that's Loki. So I had a little fun, and I had a little bit of a laugh doing that. And I've got a couple of them coming up actually. So
nice.
So we'll see. I dress myself up in my smart clothes and.
Try and treat kids to let them attack you.
Yeah. I remember the first time I did it, I failed. And they had Heimdall on. So and Martin was a little annoyed with me because I said, "Look, guys, if you vote for me, I'll give you loads of sweets." And he said, "You can't do that. That's stepping outside of the historical role." And I said, "It's Loki. I can do what I want." Yeah. So
you don't think Loki's bribed a few kids with candy before? Come on.
I don't think he'd have any problem with that.
He's done a bit worse.
Once he's decided he wants something, you're going to have a hard job stopping him.
I couldn't agree more. Well, Melvin, thank you so much for your time today. It was so great getting to know you and to know more about your background and more about the Norse mythology as well. Thank you for shining some light onto the book for us.
Thanks for having me on, guys. Thanks for your questions. Thanks for your enthusiasm.
Of course. Which
I very, very much appreciate. And thanks, as I say, for getting the book. Not everyone's got it. Some people have, I don't know really, but I think you kind of had the kind of reactions to it that I was hoping I was going to get, and it's always nice to see.
That's great.
Nice to see that going on. It's fun and it's transgressive, and it's whoa, what's he going to get up to next? This guy, and is he telling the truth? Thanks so much. Thanks for getting
pleasure, Melvin.
The right way.
There you go, guys. Loki, it just came out last month, so it's relatively new. Go pick it up. The American cover is gorgeous, I gotta say. Well done. Yeah. It's like metallic-y sheen color on
beautiful cover. Beautiful cover. I was very happy with the whole production of the thing.
Yeah, the color where it's like gray with a tinge of green. It's really fun. It's a beautiful book. So don't sleep on it, guys. Check out Loki by Melvin Burgess. Melvin, thank you again so much for coming on. We greatly appreciate it. And then thank you all so much for listening. And as always, go forth and conquer, friends. That's our catchphrase.
Why not?
Gotta have one. Why not?